The Italian Navy thought their Enigma codes were unbreakable. A mistake so rare it was mathematically impossible slipped into one message, and a 19-year-old girl saw it. In the next 72 hours, her discovery would drown 5 warships, kill 2,303 sailors, and change the Mediterranean War forever. In the spring of 1941, Bletchley Park was fighting a mathematical war it seemed destined to lose. For more than a year, Britain's brightest cryptanalysts had attempted to penetrate the Italian naval Enigma system, an encryption method protected by 3 rotating rotors, a plugboard, and a daily key schedule that produced 159 quintillion possible configurations. No one had broken it. No one had even come close. Inside a converted stable at the edge of the estate, a small building known simply as the Cottage, 19-year-old Mavis Lillian Lever worked. Through the early hours of March 25th, surrounded by piles of failure, hundreds of intercepted Italian naval signals filled the room, each one a dead end. The cottage remained cold even in daylight. Wartime fuel restrictions meant the heating rarely functioned. Those who worked there later recalled rubbing their hands together for warmth between calculations. It was in this environment that Mavis had spent 6 months learning to see patterns others had missed. She had arrived at Bletchley Park in late 1940. Withdrawn from her studies at University College London after the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign disrupted academic life, she had intended to study German. Instead, her linguistic abilities and unusual talent for pattern recognition were noticed by her professors, who discreetly recommended her to the government code and cipher school. She received no formal cryptographic training when she stepped onto the grounds of Bletchley Park, only an assignment to the unit led by the veteran codebreaker Dilwyn Dilly Knox. Knox's section had been given the near-impossible task of analyzing non-German Enigma traffic, including Italian naval communications. Yet the unit worked under a shadow of institutional pessimism. By early 1941, senior leadership had concluded that the Italian naval variant of Enigma was effectively unbreakable. Daily key changes, meticulous operating procedures, and the discipline of Italian radio operators left no exploitable patterns. Official orders instructed Knox to abandon the project. He ignored them. For Mavis, the consequences of failure were not abstract. Every unbroken message meant another British convoy in the Mediterranean sailing without warning of Italian fleet movements. In February and March alone, dozens of merchant vessels had been sunk en route to Egypt, many disappearing with all hands. Supplies were dwindling. Commanders in Cairo warned of collapse if the losses continued. And within those convoys were ships on which her own brother served as a Royal Navy communications officer. By the time dawn broke on March 25th, Mavis had slept little. Her section worked long shifts, often rotating through nights without rest. Driven by the possibility, however remote, that a human error inside the Italian system might one day reveal an opening, she sifted through ciphertext groups that seemed indistinguishable from the hundreds she had processed before, searching for something that ought not to exist. A break in the rigid mathematical perfection Enigma was designed to maintain. At her desk in the cold cottage, the weight of 159 quintillion possibilities pressed against a young woman who had no reason to believe she would succeed. Yet she kept going, driven by a quiet resolve, by the knowledge that the Mediterranean War was turning against Britain, and by the understanding shared by only a handful of people that a single mistake inside a single message could change everything. By early 1941, the Mediterranean was no longer just a body of water on the map of Europe's war. It had become a narrow, lethal corridor on which the future of British power in North Africa depended. Every ship that crossed it carried more than cargo. It carried the survival of an army. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, the Regia Marina, the Royal Italian Navy, took up a central role in Axis strategy. From its main bases at Taranto, Naples, and other ports along the Italian peninsula, the fleet sat astride the sea lanes that linked the British base at Gibraltar in the west to Malta and Alexandria in the east. Those routes were the lifelines keeping the British 8th Army supplied in Egypt and, later, along the North African coast. British convoys crossing the Mediterranean were vulnerable on all sides. Italian submarines and surface raiders hunted them from beneath and above the waves. Long-range aircraft from Italian and German squadrons flew from bases in Sicily, Libya, and mainland Italy, prowling the sea for slow, heavily loaded merchant ships. Each successful interception meant torpedoes in the water, bombs from the sky, and more white wakes ending in black smoke. The statistics behind the headlines were brutal. Convoys bound for Egypt carried fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, and reinforcements. When those ships went down, the losses cascaded along the entire British position in the Middle East. Fuel shortages curtailed armored operations. Ammunition shortages limited artillery support. Even basic rations were affected. Commanders warned London that, without secure supply lines, North Africa could not be held. Italian naval forces were not acting blindly. They were supported by a communications network coordinated from Supermarina, the Italian Naval High Command in Rome. Orders for fleet movements, submarine patrol lines, and interception plans were sent using Enigma-enciphered radio messages. Those signals directed battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines into positions from which they could ambush British convoys or avoid superior British forces. On the British side, the picture was far less clear. Without reliable insight into Italian intentions, convoy planners in Alexandria and Cairo often had to guess where and when to sail. They could adjust routes based on sighted enemy ships or reconnaissance flights, but they lacked the detailed, forward-looking knowledge that only broken enemy communications could provide. Every decision to send ships into the central Mediterranean felt like rolling loaded dice. Losses mounted as the months passed. Merchantmen torpedoed off the Greek and Libyan coasts. Escorts crippled or sunk while trying to shield their charges. Survivors, when they reached land, brought back the same stories: sudden contact, overwhelming attack, and little time to maneuver. In many cases, Italian forces seemed to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. For those working at Bletchley Park, the Mediterranean situation was not an abstract strategic summary. It appeared in the daily traffic of intercepted, but unreadable signals. Italian naval messages, enciphered on Enigma machines using naval key settings, arrived in volume. They were logged, sorted, and filed, but without a break into the system. They remained opaque. Among the thousands of British sailors in that theater was a communications officer named Geoffrey Lever, serving aboard a Royal Navy ship in the Mediterranean. His correspondence, when it reached home through wartime censorship and delays, reflected the reality at sea: constant threat from submarines and surface raiders, and the unsettling sense of operating without clear intelligence on enemy movements. Convoys sailed with what information could be gathered from scouting and reports, but many left harbor without any firm knowledge of where the main Italian units were. For Mavis at Bletchley Park, the Mediterranean was not a distant campaign marked with arrows on a map. It was the region where her brother served and where every unbroken Italian naval message might conceal the orders that sent battleships and cruisers across his path. Each time she saw a new page of enciphered Italian traffic added to the growing piles in the cottage, it represented a decision not yet known to British commanders: a sortie planned, a rendezvous scheduled, an interception ordered. Without access to those decisions, the Royal Navy's position was fundamentally reactive. Ships attacked, and only afterward did intelligence analysts try to reconstruct what the enemy must have known. And when the contrast with what Enigma might reveal was stark, if the Italian naval settings could be broken, British commanders would not be guessing. They would be reading. They would know where enemy forces were ordered to be, which convoys were being targeted, and which routes were momentarily safer. Until that happened, the Mediterranean remained what it had become by early 1941, a narrow, contested sea where every crossing carried the risk of disaster, and where the absence of reliable intelligence was as deadly as any torpedo. In the cottage at Bletchley Park, that absence took the form of reams of intersected Italian messages, present, visible, yet unreadable. Behind their random-looking letter groups lay the fate of ships, the outcome of operations, and the survival of men like Geoffrey. It was into this context of strangled convoys, threatened armies, and a lifeline under siege that the events of March 25, 1941, would unfold. On the morning of the 25th of March 1941, another routine day of work began at Bletchley Park. Wireless interception stations scattered across Britain and beyond had captured fresh Italian naval signals during the night, transmitting them onward to the codebreakers. Among them was one message sent from the Italian Naval High Command, Supermarina, 2 units of the fleet operating in the Mediterranean. By the time that signal reached the cottage, it had already followed a familiar path, intercepted as a stream of Morse, written down as letter groups, and forwarded as raw ciphertext. To most eyes, it looked like every other Enigma message, blocks of 5-letter groups, line after line of apparent nonsense. For months, The Italian naval traffic had been exactly that, a constant reminder of an enemy system that remained unbroken. Mavis began her work as she usually did, with the mechanical patience that cryptanalysis demanded. Notes, pencils, and reference sheets stood ready. The message was laid out in front of her in its 5-letter blocks. The first step was not to solve it, but to examine it, count letter frequencies, look for repeated patterns, check message length and structure, and compare it with others sent the same day. The Enigma machine that had produced this ciphertext was a sophisticated combination of electrical and mechanical design. Each keystroke on the machine advanced rotors inside, changing the internal wiring path so that the same letter, pressed twice in succession, would normally encrypt to different outputs. Combined with the plugboard that swapped letter pairs at the input and output stages, the result was an encryption system designed specifically to avoid simple repetitions and patterns. This design principle meant that the same 6-letter word, typed at different points in a message, should almost never appear as the same 6-letter string in the ciphertext. The rotors would be in different positions each time, and the signal would pass through a different sequence of electrical paths. Any repeated pattern in the enciphered text therefore attracted attention, because it hinted at a potential irregularity in how the machine had been used. As Mavis moved through the message, she did what hundreds of analysts before her had done: marked letter frequencies, noted likely indicators of standard formatting, and considered which parts might contain operational content versus filler or padding. Naval signals often used formal phrases or repeated structural elements. Operators also used nulls or filler words to bring messages up to a desired length, or to avoid revealing exact content through message size. These habits, while natural from a human perspective, could sometimes create footholds for cryptanalysts. In this particular message, somewhere in the interior of the text, she encountered something that should not have been there. A sequence of 6 letters appeared once. Further down, separated by dozens of characters, the exact same 6-letter group appeared again. Same letters, same order, same grouping. In an ordinary substitution cipher, that kind of repetition might not have been remarkable, but with Enigma, especially under correct operating procedures, it approached the mathematically implausible. The combination of rotor stepping and plugboard permutations was specifically intended to prevent such echoes. The fact that this message contained one suggested not that the machine had malfunctioned, but that the human being using it had slipped. Italian naval operators were trained, like their German counterparts, to vary their messages and avoid predictable content. However, studies of Italian traffic at Bletchley Park had already shown that some operators tended to rely on familiar stock phrases and repeated conventions. In particular, certain padding words appeared regularly as fillers, generic terms, prepositions, or expressions regarded as harmless and mundane. The presence of 2 identical 6-letter ciphertext groups strongly indicated that the same plaintext word, or a closely related form, had been typed twice at different rotor positions. If that word was one of these routine fillers, then its likely plaintext could be guessed. And if its plaintext could be guessed, the internal Enigma settings that produced that specific mapping from plaintext to ciphertext could in principle be deduced by working backwards. The insight here was not that the Enigma machine had failed, but that its human user had transformed a theoretically unbreakable system into a vulnerable one. Through repetition, a filler word, chosen for convenience and typed twice in the same message, had created 2 anchor points in the sea of possibilities. Between those anchor points stretched a chain of rotor positions and plugboard settings that, with careful analysis, could be reconstructed. What had seemed at first like another routine, unreadable signal now contained within it a subtle but crucial irregularity. The improbable repetition signaled that this message might be different from the hundreds that had come before it. Instead of offering only a wall of ciphertext, it offered a crack. From a mathematical perspective, the odds that a random Enigma message would naturally produce 2 identical 6-letter ciphertext groups from unrelated plaintext at different rotor positions were extraordinarily small. The structure of the machine and the way the rotors advanced made such coincidences extremely unlikely over the length of a typical naval signal. That improbability gave weight to the hypothesis that the operator had in fact typed the same plaintext group twice. For the cryptanalyst, the next step was clear but demanding. If one could posit a plausible Italian filler word that matched the presumed plaintext of those positions, one could then attempt to deduce which rotor order, ring settings, and plugboard connections would convert that word into the observed ciphertext on both occasions. The problem was no longer an undifferentiated space of 159 quintillion keys. It had been reduced, by one human habit, to a more constrained search. On that day in March 1941, in the cold cottage at Bletchley Park, the discovery of that repeated sequence transformed a single Italian naval message from yet another unsolved fragment of the war into a potential key to the entire communications network. A filler word, typed twice by an operator far away, had opened a narrow but real path into a system previously judged unassailable. At the center of the Italian naval enigma problem stood a man whose name was already etched into the history of cryptology long before the Second World War began. Dilwyn Dilly Knox had cracked codes in the First World War, contributing directly to British efforts against German and Russian communications. By the late 1930s, his expertise made him one of the few people in Britain capable of understanding the depth of the Enigma challenge. But age and illness had taken their toll. By 1941, Knox was in his mid-50s, visibly weakened by what would later be diagnosed as stomach cancer. Despite this, he worked with the intensity of a man who knew time was not on his side. Knox refused the formality of Bletchley Park's main mansion. Instead, he ran his section from the small, drafty building known as the Cottage. Those who worked with him often described the place as cramped, cold, and unmistakably unconventional. Papers were left in stacks. Books and reference materials filled every surface. And Knox himself preferred to work in an environment that seemed chaotic to outsiders but made perfect sense to him. His approach to cryptanalysis differed sharply from the mathematicians who dominated other sections. He believed deeply in intuition, language patterns, and the human habits that encrypted messages often concealed. But in February 1941, a directive arrived from higher command that threatened to end the Cottage's work entirely. After months of failed attempts, the leadership of the government code and cipher school concluded that the Italian naval enigma variant was effectively unbreakable. They ordered Knox to abandon the project and redirect his section toward work considered more promising. To the rest of Bletchley Park, the Italian system was viewed as a dead-ended drain on limited manpower at a critical moment in the war. Knox disagreed. Quietly, and without making his defiance explicit, he continued to work in secret. He believed the Italian operators, unlike their German counterparts, would eventually reveal predictable habits, repetitions, structural patterns, or filler words that might expose the system's vulnerabilities. His long experience had taught him that human error was the Achilles heel of even the most sophisticated machinery. The danger, however, was clear. Disobeying official orders meant risking the closure of his unit, reassignment, or worse, everyone working under him knew it. Inside the Cottage, that knowledge produced a constant, unspoken tension. The atmosphere carried a mix of urgency and caution. Analysts moved quickly but kept their work discreet. The windows were often fogged from breath and low heating. The door stayed closed for long stretches, and the sense of operating outside official approval hung over the team. The younger members, like Mavis Lever, understood the stakes. If the Italian project was discovered without tangible progress, their positions were vulnerable. Wartime staffing was fluid, and reassignment could come without warning. Despite the pressure, a distinct mentor-student relationship formed between Knox and Mavis. He recognized in her the same instincts he relied upon, not mathematically trained, but exceptionally perceptive too. Linguistic rhythm, letter behavior, and structural anomalies. He often encouraged analysts to think not only like codebreakers, but like the people sending the messages. Italian radio operators had their habits, their shortcuts, their moments of carelessness. These small consistencies, he believed, were the key. Mavis learned quickly in this unconventional environment. Her tasks began with basic analysis, frequency counts, pattern identification, message comparison, but Knox guided her toward the subtler aspects of Enigma traffic. He taught her to examine messages as if they were pieces of human communication, not just encrypted text. Over time, she became one of the section's most capable analysts despite her young age. But with that responsibility came the weight of secrecy. The Cottage was under scrutiny. Senior staff from the main mansion occasionally checked on the progress of various sections, and each unexpected visitor brought the fear that the Italian work might be exposed. The analysts maintained plausible alternative tasks, ready to shift their desks or conceal papers if needed. In the wartime bureaucracy of Bletchley Park, even a rumor of disregarded orders could lead to consequences. When Mavis identified the repeated, 6-letter ciphertext group on March 25, 1941, she knew immediately that the discovery could be significant, but she also knew it might draw attention, and attention was dangerous. Bringing the message to Knox required more than technical explanation. It required convincing him that the find was worth the risk of further defiance. Knox understood the implications at once. The repetition violated the core principle of how Enigma was intended to operate. Such an anomaly could only arise from a human pattern of repeated plaintext group typed at different rotor positions. It was the type of error he had spent months anticipating, but recognizing potential was not enough. In the precarious state of the Cottage's work, only one thing mattered: results, without proof. Any claim about a possible break in the system could be dismissed as coincidence, and if it was dismissed, the secret continuation of the Italian project would likely end. With the intercepted message in hand, Knox faced the same choice he had confronted for months: obey the official directive, or trust his long experience. That intuition sometimes mattered more than orders. The weight of that decision hung in the cramped office as he examined the repeated group. He said nothing dramatic, no declaration, no theatrical promise, just the expectation of a man who had spent his life pursuing patterns through impossible odds. He placed the sheet of ciphertext back on the desk and set the next step clearly in motion. Prove it works. The discovery of the repeated 6-letter group on the 25th of March 1941 marked only the beginning of the real work. Inside the cottage, the clock had already started its silent countdown. Bletchley Park required daily progress reports, and orders had been issued to halt work on the Italian naval Enigma months earlier. If the cottage couldn't demonstrate a breakthrough by morning, the entire project risked being shut down. For Mavis Lever, the next hours unfolded without pause. There was no scheduled rest, no break for meals, no moment to step outside the cold room to steady her nerves. She sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of earlier failures, pencils worn blunt, hands stiff from the cold. The air inside the cottage was quiet except for the sound of paper shifting and occasional footsteps across the uneven floorboards. Everything depended on transforming that improbable repetition into proof. The task ahead was as complex as any attempted at Bletchley Park. If the repeated ciphertext truly represented the same plaintext group, then the internal state of the Italian Enigma machine, at two different moments, could theoretically be reconstructed. That meant identifying a plausible Italian filler word, one that naval operators frequently used, and testing whether it could have produced the ciphertext observed. The math behind it was unforgiving. Enigma's 3 rotors each contained 26 positions. Their order, ring settings, and stepping mechanics determined how the electrical signal traveled through the wiring. The plug board added an additional layer, exchanging up to 10 pairs of letters before and after the rotor sequence. Each guessed plaintext letter had to survive this entire chain and emerge as the ciphertext observed. If even one transformation failed to match, the hypothesis collapsed. Mavis worked through these transformations methodically, cross-checking rotor steps and eliminating combinations that could not account for both repeated groups. Her approach was shaped not by formal mathematics, but by the intuitive pattern sense that had brought her to Bletchley Park. Instead of brute force calculation, she narrowed the field by understanding operator habits, common Italian filler structures, and the structural constraints of the machine. Hours passed. Outside, the night deepened. Inside the cottage, the small team continued their tasks, but attention gradually shifted toward Mavis's desk. Rotor orders were tested, discarded, and recalculated. Plugboard assumptions were adjusted. When one hypothesis failed, she moved to the next. The repetition that had first looked like a rare coincidence slowly became a navigational marker and anchor point inside a system designed to leave no trace. By early evening, fatigue had set in. Her hands trembled from cold and concentration, yet the structure of her calculations began to converge. One possible chain of rotor positions matched both plaintext projections. The plugboard settings required were few and plausible. For the first time, the Italian naval Enigma did not appear invulnerable. It appeared solvable. Late in the evening, with the margin of time shrinking, the final test awaited. In Knox's office, secured in a locked safe, was a captured Italian Enigma machine recovered by the Royal Navy earlier in the war. Its presence was classified, known only to a handful of people. If the settings she calculated were correct, the machine would decode the message exactly. The rotors were inserted, the ring settings adjusted, the plugboard connected according to her notes. The machine's lamps flickered as the encrypted message was typed in. Then, for the first time, Italian naval plaintext appeared clear, grammatical, and unmistakably correct. The breakthrough was immediate and complete. A second intercepted message, using the same daily key, produced the same result. The Italian naval enigma for the 25th of March 1941 had been broken. But the revelation went beyond cryptographic success. The content of the decrypted messages revealed the movements and intentions of Italy's main battle fleet. A major operation was underway. A planned interception of British convoys was imminent. The information, delivered in time, could shift the course of the Mediterranean campaign. Mavis had broken the Unbreakable, and the message she decoded would soon determine the fate of thousands far from the cottage's cold walls. The decoded Italian messages reached Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham on the evening of the 25th of March 1941. They revealed detailed orders from Supermarina, Italy's main battle fleet, including the battleship Vittorio Veneto and multiple heavy cruisers, would move to intercept British convoys near Crete. The operation was planned with confidence. Italian commanders believed the British were unaware of their approach. They had no reason to suspect their communications had been compromised. For the Italians at sea, the operation followed established doctrine. The battle group sailed from Taranto on the 27th of March, maintaining radio discipline, confident in their numerical strength and the range of their ships. Their reconnaissance aircraft had not reported any signs of major British fleet movements. Conditions along the Mediterranean were calm. From the Italian perspective, the opportunity to isolate and destroy exposed British convoys seemed within reach. On the British side, Cunningham had already begun preparing a counterstroke. The decrypted signals provided not only the Italian intentions, but also the timing and location of their advance. Cunningham understood that any visible mobilization from Alexandria would alert Axis observers. Italian intelligence agents monitored the harbor daily. Any sudden departure of battleships or cruisers risked exposing the plan. Cunningham chose deception. On the 27th of March, the day the Italian fleet put to sea, he made a point of remaining visible ashore in Alexandria, playing golf and presenting the appearance of routine. Only after dusk did he quietly board his flagship, HMS Warships. The Mediterranean fleet slipped out of the harbor under strict radio silence, using darkness as concealment. 3 battleships, an aircraft carrier, multiple cruisers, and over a dozen destroyers moved north, toward a precise intercept point derived from the Bletchley Park decrypts. The opening phase of the engagement unfolded on the 28th of March. Aircraft from HMS Formidable located the Italian fleet and launched torpedo strikes. One torpedo struck Vittorio Veneto, reducing her speed and forcing her to withdraw. Another attack later in the day left the heavy cruiser Pola dead in the water. Italian command ordered the cruisers Zara and Fiume, along with 2 destroyers, to turn back and assist the immobilized ship. They did not know that Cunningham's battleships were approaching their position at night. Radar gave the British a decisive advantage. The Italian ships, lacking comparable equipment, moved through the darkness unaware that they were sailing directly into the path of battleships. Armed with 15-inch guns, shortly before 20 to 30, British destroyers detected the Italian rescue group at close range. Cunningham maneuvered his battleships to position at little more than 2 miles a distance at which their heavy guns were overwhelmingly lethal. What followed at Cape Matapan was one of the most one-sided naval engagements of the war. At 20 to 27, British battleships illuminated their targets with powerful searchlights. The beams cut across the sea, revealing the Italian cruisers in stark brilliance. Within seconds, Warships, Valiant, and Barham opened fire. The effect was devastating. At such close range, armor-piercing shells penetrated with ease. Fiume was struck repeatedly within the first minute. Zara followed. Towering plumes of flame rose from exploding ammunition magazines. Compartments flooded with superheated steam. Gun crews were overwhelmed before they could respond. The Italian destroyers, Alfieri and Carducci, attempting to defend the cruisers, were quickly disabled and sunk. In less than an hour, thousands of men were dead. Many others struggled in the water as debris, oil, and fire spread across the surface. The Italian ships had never stood a chance. They had sailed unknowingly into a battle whose outcome had been shaped days earlier inside a small room in Buckinghamshire. Cunningham ordered rescue operations, and British destroyers pulled hundreds of survivors from the sea. But at dawn, German aircraft appeared, forcing the British to withdraw and leaving many Italians still in the water. In all, Approximately 2,303 Italian sailors lost their lives at Cape Matapan. The battle ended Italian attempts to challenge British naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean for the remainder of the war. It was a victory defined not by glory, but by the stark consequences of intelligence, timing, and overwhelming force, where a single break in Enigma had shaped the destruction that followed. The impact of the Enigma breakthrough and the victory at Cape Matapan was felt far beyond the waters, where the Italian cruisers burned and sank. In the weeks that followed, the strategic situation in the Mediterranean shifted in ways that had seemed unlikely. Only months before, for the first time since Italy's entry into the war, the Royal Navy could operate with a clear understanding of enemy movements. From late March onward, Bletchley Park was able to read Italian naval signals with increasing frequency. Each decoded message removed uncertainty from the planning tables in Alexandria and Cairo. The Mediterranean supply line, so often interrupted by submarine ambushes and surface raiders, began to stabilize. British convoys could be routed based on intelligence rather than intuition. Ships were diverted around known danger points or timed to avoid Italian sorties. Altogether, losses did not vanish, but the pattern of catastrophic convoy destruction eased. The immediate crisis facing British forces in Egypt, shortages of fuel, ammunition, and essential stores, began to recede. This shift carried direct consequences for the North African campaign. With supplies reaching Alexandria and onward to the front, the British Eighth Army regained the logistical footing it had been lacking. Later operations under General Bernard Montgomery depended heavily on the steady flow of materiel through the Mediterranean corridor. The ability to read Italian naval traffic did not win the North African campaign on its own, but it ensured that the Eighth Army had the fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements required to stand against Axis forces. Intelligence, in this case, was the quiet precondition for battlefield success. Amid these strategic developments was a smaller, personal outcome that never appeared in official reports. On the 30th of March 1941, just days after the Enigma break, one of the Mediterranean convoys sailed from Malta toward Alexandria. Among its escorts was the ship carrying Mavis Lever's brother, Geoffrey, serving as a communications officer. Under ordinary circumstances, the convoy would have departed with little awareness of enemy fleet dispositions. Instead, it sailed along a route chosen with the benefit of detailed knowledge of Italian naval movements. The convoy reached Alexandria without loss. For those at sea, the delivery was another successful operation. For those at Bletchley Park, it was a demonstration of what intelligence could achieve. But for Mavis, it was something she could not speak of. Bound by the Official Secrets Act, she carried the knowledge in silence. Her contribution remained hidden, even from the person whose life had been shaped by it. A breakthrough that altered the course of a naval campaign, strengthened the British position in North Africa, and saved thousands of lives, was known publicly only as the work of a team at Bletchley Park. The world would not learn her name for decades. For decades after the war, almost nothing about Bletchley Park was publicly known. Those who had worked there were bound by the Official Secrets Act, prevented from describing even the smallest detail of their contributions. Mavis Lever, by then Mavis Beatty, returned to civilian life without any public acknowledgement of the role she had played in one of the Mediterranean's most decisive naval victories. She married a fellow codebreaker, raised a family, and built a career as a garden historian. The events of March 1941 remained locked behind classification, known only to a small circle of wartime colleagues. It was not until the 1970s, when British government files began to be declassified, that the work of Bletchley Park entered public awareness. Books and documentaries focused heavily on Alan Turing and the bomb machines, cementing their place in historical memory. The contributions of many others, especially the women who made up the majority of Bletchley's workforce, were often condensed into passing references. In early publications about the Italian naval Enigma break, the achievement was attributed broadly to Dilly Knox's research section, not to the individual who had found the pattern that made it possible. Only later did historians uncover the full account. Archival documents and newly released correspondence revealed that the breakthrough at Cape Matapan had begun with Mavis's identification of a repeated filler word and operator's small lapse that she alone recognized as significant. Gradually, her name reappeared in histories of cryptanalysis, and she began receiving formal honor years after the fact. France awarded her the Legion d'Honneur. In 1987, GCHQ acknowledged her lifetime contributions. In 2012, By the time of her death in 2013, the story of her role was known but still understated, an essential piece of wartime history that rarely received more than a paragraph in wider narratives. Yet the truth remained unchanged against the weight of an unbreakable system. It was not a machine or a formula that opened the door. It was one instance of human intuition, the recognition that a filler word, typed twice in one message, could alter the course of the Mediterranean Sea.